I was fired for theft I didn't commit. My boss set me up to hide his own schemes. While he spent the stolen money on a luxurious lifestyle, I quietly gathered evidence. Then I made sure he lost everything, his job, his family, his freedom. I had been with the company for 5 years. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills and offered stability in an uncertain economy. Anderson Financial Services had a decent reputation in the industry, and I had gradually worked my way up from entry-level to senior analyst. I handled client portfolios, maintained detailed records, and spent long hours ensuring everything balanced to the penny. My performance reviews were consistently above average, and I believed I was on track for a promotion to team leader. That Tuesday morning seemed ordinary enough. Rain tapped against the windows of our 23rd floor office as I sipped my coffee and reviewed quarterly projections. My desk phone rang at 9:17 a.m. Michael? Mark Davis would like to see you in his office immediately. The voice of Mark's executive assistant carried an unusual edge. Mark Davis was our department head, 48, Harvard MBA, with a smile that never reached his eyes. He drove a midnight blue Tesla and wore suits that cost more than my monthly rent. Something about him had always set off warning bells in my mind, but I'd kept my head down and focused on my work. I straightened my tie, grabbed my notebook, and made my way to the corner office with its sweeping views of downtown. "Close the door," Mark said without looking up from his computer. He was typing something rapidly, his fingers striking the keys with unnecessary force. Finally, he removed his designer glasses and fixed his gaze on me. "We have a problem, Michael," he said, his voice calm but tinged with what I mistook for disappointment. "The quarterly financial audit has revealed some irregularities. A discrepancy of approximately $150,000. My stomach tightened. "Which accounts?" "I can pull the records in." "That won't be necessary," Mark interrupted, leaning back in his leather chair. "The forensic accountants have already traced everything. All signs point to you." The room seemed to tilt sideways. "That's impossible," I managed. "I didn't." "Let me be clear," he cut in. "We have evidence of unauthorized transfers, modified records, everything. It's quite comprehensive." "There must be some mistake," I insisted, my voice rising. "I've never taken a penny. You know how careful I am with documentation." Mark's expression hardened. "The company is prepared to handle this quietly. No police, no charges, nothing that would follow you to your next position. Sign the resignation letter, return your badge, and leave today. This can all disappear." "You honestly believe I stole money?" The question hung in the air between us. A smirk played at the corner of his mouth before disappearing. "What I believe doesn't matter anymore. The decision has been made upstairs." Less than an hour later, I stood on the sidewalk outside the building, a cardboard box containing my personal effects clutched in my arms. No severance, no references, no explanation to my colleagues. Just gone, branded a thief without a chance to defend myself. That night, alone in my apartment, the shock gave way to anger. Why me? What had I done to deserve this? But as I scrolled through my contacts, trying to decide who to call for advice, a clearer question emerged: why had Mark seemed so prepared? His entire performance felt rehearsed, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. I remembered how Mark had inserted himself into several of my biggest accounts over the past year. How he had insisted on handling certain client communications personally. How his lifestyle seemed increasingly lavish: the new car, the vacation photos from the Maldives, the custom suits. Instead of reaching out to friends or family, I opened my laptop and began to piece together what I knew. Something wasn't adding up, and I needed to understand what had happened before I could move forward. The next morning, I created a detailed timeline of the projects I'd worked on, the accounts I'd managed, and every interaction with Mark over the past year. Patterns emerged. Client complaints that never made it to my desk. Reports that had been altered after I submitted them. Meetings I'd been excluded from at the last minute. But I needed more than suspicions. I needed proof. I called Janet, the office manager who had processed my termination paperwork. We'd always been friendly, and she sounded genuinely sad about my departure. "Janet, I need to understand what happened. Did anyone access my computer in the weeks before I was let go?" Her hesitation told me everything. "Michael, I shouldn't be talking to you about this. Please. My entire career is at stake." She sighed. "IT pulled your login records as part of the investigation. There were after-hours accesses from your account for weeks, but the timestamps were when I know you'd already left the building. I mentioned it, but they said you must have stayed late or logged in remotely. I hadn't done either. Someone had used my credentials. Over the next 2 weeks, I lived like a ghost. I barely slept, subsisting on coffee and determination. I reached out to former colleagues who had left Anderson Financial under similar clouds. There were 5 in the past 3 years, all from our department, all accused of financial improprieties or performance issues that appeared suddenly after years of solid work. One name kept coming up, Robert Chen, a former senior accountant who had left 8 months before. He agreed to meet me at a coffee shop on the other side of town. "I knew they'd come for you eventually," Robert said after I explained my situation. His eyes darted nervously around the cafe. "I noticed discrepancies in the quarterly reports last year. Transfers that didn't match client instructions, fees that exceeded our published rates. When I started documenting them, Mark called me in and said there had been complaints about my work. 2 weeks later, I was gone. Did you keep your documentation?" I asked, hope rising. Robert shook his head. "I was scared. I have a family, a mortgage. I couldn't risk it." He leaned forward. "But I know someone who might help. Cynthia Williams in accounting. She processes all the wire transfers. If anyone can trace where the money went, it's her." Cynthia was hesitant at first, but when I explained what had happened, something shifted in her expression. "Mark has been pressuring me to process transfers without the usual documentation," she admitted. When I questioned it, he said it came from above and I should focus on my job if I wanted to keep it. With Cynthia's help, I gained access to financial records that painted a clear picture. For over 2 years, Mark had been siphoning funds through a network of shell companies. Client money disappearing into consulting fees for services never rendered. Expense reports with inflated numbers. All leading back to entities owned by a holding company registered in Delaware. The owner of that holding company? MRD Ventures LLC, Mark Robert Davis. I dug deeper. Mark had a gambling problem that had spiraled out of control 3 years ago. He'd taken out second and third mortgages on his house. He'd emptied his children's college funds. And when those resources were exhausted, he'd turned to the company's money. But this wasn't enough. I needed to understand how he'd framed me specifically. I contacted an IT specialist I'd gone to college with. For a case of premium whiskey, he analyzed the data Janet had slipped me. Mark had installed keylogging software on my computer 6 months earlier during a routine upgrade. He'd had my passwords, my access, everything he needed to create a perfect paper trail leading to me. Armed with this knowledge, I could have gone straight to the police or the company's board. But something deeper burned inside me. Mark hadn't just stolen my job, he'd stolen my reputation, my future, my peace of mind. A simple arrest wouldn't restore what I'd lost. I needed a plan that would dismantle Mark's life as thoroughly as he'd dismantled mine. First, I compiled a detailed dossier of evidence, bank records, transfer authorizations, the shell company documentation. Every transaction, every fraud, meticulously organized and annotated. Then, I researched Mark's personal life. His wife, Elizabeth, came from money, old money. Their wedding had been featured in the society pages. They had 2 teenage children attending prestigious private schools. Elizabeth sat on the boards of 3 charities and hosted fundraisers at their mansion in the suburbs. I learned that Elizabeth's family had strict values when it came to money and reputation. Her father had built his business on integrity and expected the same from his son-in-law. Mark's position at Anderson Financial had come through his father-in-law's connections. I created 3 packages of information. The first went anonymously to the SEC, detailing the financial fraud and providing enough evidence to launch an investigation. The second went to Charles Anderson, the aging founder of Anderson Financial who had stepped back from day-to-day operations but still owned controlling interest. The third package was different. It contained not just evidence of the fraud but detailed records of Mark's gambling, his visits to high-end escort services, the money he diverted from his children's futures. This package I delivered personally, leaving it with Elizabeth's housekeeper when I knew Mark would be at the office. Then I waited. The wheels of bureaucracy turn slowly, but not as slowly as one might expect, and millions of dollars are involved. 2 weeks after I sent the packages, I received a call from Charles Anderson himself. "Mr. Parker," his gravelly voice had the weight of authority. "I've reviewed your information with our legal team. We'd like to meet." The meeting took place in a private room at Anderson's club, wood-paneled walls, leather chairs, absolute discretion. Anderson was accompanied by the company's chief counsel and head of security. "I founded this company 43 years ago," Anderson said after I'd walked them through the evidence. "My name is on the door. The thought that someone has been stealing from our clients, compromising our reputation." His face flushed with anger. "How much do you want?" I was confused. "Sir. To make this go away. What's your price?" I understood then. He thought I was blackmailing the company. "I don't want money," I said carefully. "I want my job back, my reputation restored, and Mark Davis held accountable." Anderson studied me for a long moment. "You were willing to bring down my entire company to get revenge on Mark?" "No, sir. I sent the information to you first because I believe in the company. The SEC filing is contingent, it only activates if certain conditions aren't met within 30 days. A slow smile spread across Anderson's face. "You're either very clever or very foolish. Either way, I think we can work something out." The next morning, federal agents arrived at Anderson Financial. They took possession of computers, files, and Mark Davis himself, escorted from the building in handcuffs as his colleagues watched in stunned silence. But that was just the beginning. The same afternoon, Mark's face appeared on the local news. "Financial executive charged with embezzlement" ran the headline. By evening, the story had expanded to include his gambling debts and connections to escort services. Elizabeth filed for divorce the following day. Her family's attorneys moved with remarkable efficiency to freeze all their joint assets and remove Mark from their accounts. His father-in-law issued a statement expressing profound disappointment and emphasizing that the family had been deceived by a man they had welcomed and trusted. Within a week, Mark's life had imploded. His bail had been set astronomically high due to flight risk concerns I'd helpfully suggested to the prosecutors. His former friends and colleagues refused his calls. His country club membership was revoked. The board of his children's private school asked that he not attend his daughter's upcoming graduation ceremony. I watched it all unfold from my newly restored office at Anderson Financial, now with a promotion and a substantial raise as compensation for the misunderstanding. Charles Anderson had decided that keeping me close was preferable to risking my evidence becoming public. The official story was that I had helped uncover Mark's fraud, transforming me from scapegoat to hero in one smooth corporate revision. The final piece fell into place 3 months later. I received a text message from an unknown number. "Visiting hours are Tuesdays and Thursdays, 2 to 4 p.m. He has no other visitors." I debated whether to go. What would I say to him? What could possibly satisfy the anger that had driven me for months? In the end, curiosity won out. I arrived at the detention center on a Thursday afternoon, passed through security, and waited in the sterile visitation room. Mark shuffled in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his designer stubble replaced by an unkempt beard, the confidence drained from his posture. He didn't recognize me at first. When he did, his eyes widened. "You," he whispered, sinking into the chair opposite me. "Me," I confirmed. "You did all this." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "You taught me an important lesson, Mark. You showed me how vulnerable we all are when someone decides to destroy us." He leaned forward, his voice hoarse. "Why? Why go to such lengths? You got your job back. You could have walked away." I considered the question carefully. "Because you would have done it again. To someone else. Someone who might not have been able to fight back." "My children won't speak to me," he said, his eyes hollow. "My wife's family has paid for prosecutors to pursue additional charges. I'll die in prison." "Perhaps," I said, rising to leave. "Or perhaps you'll emerge someday with a better understanding of consequences. Either way, I won't be thinking about you anymore. I have a life to rebuild." As I walked out of the detention center into the bright afternoon sun, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet certainty that justice, however imperfect, had been served. My phone buzzed with a text from a colleague at my new company. I'd accepted a position with Andersen Financial's biggest competitor the previous week. Life was moving forward. The past was finally where it belonged. Behind me.